Hello, and a very warm welcome to episode 21 of my comprehensive Ancient Astrology course, in which we will be taking a closer look at the 5 main ancient aspects. These important planetary connections are actually very specific angular relationships that clearly show us how the energies flow and interact between the planets. In the practice of ancient astrology, only these 5 main aspects were used exclusively, and no others were considered significant. And not as in modern astrology, with additional ones as well. And here we will also stick only to these 5 ancient main aspects, because for our goal, namely to permanently raise our energetic level to a new standard, we don't need any more. Generally speaking, in general, ancient astrology is concise and compact, essential, clear and logical in its structure and presentation. And that's exactly what we need. For our project, for our goal, because we don't want to overload ourselves with any, unnecessary information for our purpose, which might end up confusing us or simply distracting us from our goal. In that sense, because we just end up overloading ourselves with all this knowledge that we don't actually need. So we only take what we really need, what truly helps us move forward, where we have a clear structure, a logical thread. Because time's already short as it is. In the end, we only have one life at our disposal. We've set ourselves a goal of 5 years. Yes, that's already quite tight, calculated, but if you stick with it, if you really get involved, it's possible, it's doable. But you just can't afford to lose yourself along the way. You have to sort out what you really need and what can be left out. And that's where ancient astrology is perfect, because it's essential, compact, concise and focused. That's why, as a general rule, anything that's not essential, anything that's not absolutely necessary, gets left out. All right, but let's get started right away with the very first of the 5 key connections, the 5 important aspects, and that's the conjunction. And just as a reminder, this here is the celestial chart. Here in the middle, we have the Earth today. So we're using the geocentric view today, with the Earth at the centre. And here we can see that Mercury, which is shown in orange, and Saturn, which is represented in violet, are both currently orbiting around the Earth. At this particular moment, both of these planets are located in the zodiac sign of Cancer, because the sky is divided into these 12 distinct 30-degree sections, each corresponding to a different sign. These are also our 12 directions at the sky, and each direction also corresponds to 30 degrees. And here, at this moment, we now have Saturn and Mercury both positioned in Cancer, coming together in a conjunction. Here we see a merging and blending of energies of these 2 distinct and different energy qualities. In an astrological conjunction, a line is formed when 2 or more planets are positioned on the same celestial longitude, and their energies flow together harmoniously without encountering any significant barriers. Geometrically, a conjunction corresponds to the projection of 2 distinct points onto the exact same line. While their positions remain individually distinguishable, their sphere of influence, or the area in which their effects are felt, is essentially identical. Because these 2 distinct energies are both active and present at the same time, they continuously influence and affect each other. The forces, so to speak, interlock with one another, and together create an entirely new and unique quality of energy. What they do not do, however, on their own, that is, without any connections or interactions, is to either strengthen or weaken each other. They don't do that. So they are neutral. Each has its normal strength, and exactly, even though there are 2 of them, one does not amplify the other. Imagine 2 musicians sitting next to each other. And one is playing the piano, and the other is playing the violin. Yes, and that's exactly how you could imagine this particular conjunction, because these 2 musical notes are actually played together at the very same time. At first, you don't really perceive them separately, but they are 2 independent notes. They don't drown each other out, they don't amplify each other, but they also don't interfere with one another. Their sounds blend together, and it's precisely here that something new arises, something third. Something that is not just the violin and not just the piano, but a new quality of energy, a fusion, You could say both sounds are present at the same time. They interlock, they influence each other. They create a new acoustic quality. And the closer this conjunction is, i.e. in the case of a 0-degree conjunction, which would mean they are exactly on the same line, yes, the more precisely these two keys will agree with each other. But I'll show that again separately on the Astro-Detector. That's exactly where we'll take a look right now. This is a new invention, and it has also been registered with the Patent Office for protection. And of course, it is also included in all available Astro sets. You'll also find it below in the description, that is the Astro sets, which of course include the Astro-Detector. Right, and now let's take a closer look at the conjunction using the Astro-Detector. And here on the Astro-Detector, we have clearly marked the conjunction right here. The conjunction is in fact at 0 degrees. That means two planets are at 0 degrees relative to each other. They basically overlap. And that is the conjunction. It is 0 degrees, and here on the Astro-Detector, it has an orb of 10 degrees. In ancient astrology, they took it a bit further. But we want to be very precise about it. After all, we're just starting out and want to clearly experience results. That's why I've drawn it a bit tighter here, so that we now have, for all practical purposes, 5 degrees in one direction and 5 degrees in the other. Because here, the whole torus, this is actually the symbol for Taurus. This is the 30-degree section of Taurus, as you can see. And the Sun is here, at 16 degrees in Taurus. Now, we carefully hold our Astro-Detector in our hands with the 0-degree line positioned exactly. On this blue line, it's specifically marked like that in the horoscope. Also for you, yes, wherever you have a planet in your chart, there's a blue line right there, and that's exactly where you hold the Astro-Detector, with the conjunction, with the 0-degree line. And then it shows you what lies 5 degrees in one direction and 5 degrees in the other. And here, now in our example, we have Mercury positioned here. So, Mercury is in a 3-degree conjunction with the Sun. There is a conjunction here. And this 10-degree range of the conjunction, so for example 5 degrees in one direction and 5 degrees in the other direction, specifically in total, this particular range is called the orb in astrology. That means the total orb for a conjunction, in our case, is 10 degrees. That means, in other words, this is the specific area where you should be able to feel something precisely at the moment when we are tracking the moon and it is located in this particular area. In conjunction now, for example, with our Sun, then this should, in theory, have an effect, or at least some kind of noticeable influence. And that's what we then observe. Phase 1. But in this way, you know exactly when the effect begins, when it is at its absolute strongest point, and when it starts to gradually weaken again. Yes, and by doing it this way, you can now easily look up in your horoscope which specific conjunctions you have. Because the conjunction, among other things, means that these two energies are active at the same time. Of course, the closer the two planets are to each other, the stronger the effect. Then, of course, they influence each other. These forces really interlock, and together with each other, they also create a distinct and entirely new quality. Right, then let's continue now with the sextile aspect. So here we still have the planet Mercury positioned in the sign of Cancer, and now Saturn is located here in the sign of Taurus. And in this particular case, it's a 60-degree angle between them. Of course, roughly speaking, we're not being exact here. We'll do that in a moment with the Astro-Detector. Exactly. So it's about a sextile. This is mainly about an important aspect that offers a variety of possibilities and numerous opportunities. As already mentioned earlier, it's a 60-degree angle, which is a division of the circle by 6 equal parts, and this division forms a geometric shape known as a hexagon. You could also say, in other words, that the sextile is considered a resonance angle, which tends to create coherent and harmonious patterns. A harmonious geometry that is often associated with ease, with flow, with cooperation. In nature, for example, we see hexagonal patterns in honeycombs, in crystal structures, or even in water. It stands for potential and collaboration. Its energy flow is gentle, inspiring, open. It's like a light conversation, an opportunity for cooperation, support without compulsion. However, it is not active on its own. You have to consciously make use of the potential, otherwise it simply dissipates. You could also imagine 2 windows here, set at an angle to each other, with light streaming in from outside through both windows. Warm, pleasant and friendly light fills the space, but these gentle, welcoming beams of light do not automatically overlap with each other. You first have to carefully pull the curtain aside just a bit, because only then, and only after doing so, can the beams of light finally meet and come together. And that's exactly how it is with a sextile. The possibility is there all the time. Nothing is blocked or difficult in any way, but you do have to consciously and intentionally pull that curtain aside. It's very easy to do. It really takes almost no effort at all, but it does need to be moved aside so that these 2 lights can finally meet and illuminate the room with much greater strength and brightness than before. Right, and now let's take a closer look at the sextile with the Astro-Detector. So now, using the Astro-Detector, let's see where the sextiles are in our horoscope. To do this, we once again place the 0-degree line on our sun, in this case. Of course, you can also rotate it here and then hold it over any other planet you like, so that you can see if you have any other sextiles or what other connections exist. But for now, let's stick with the sun and see, where do we have them here? Sextiles. Is there anything here? No, there is absolutely nothing here. What's going on here? Here we have the second sextile. Yes, that could be something. This here is Jupiter. And in our case, we've marked the sextile here with 6 degrees. And that means 3 degrees in one direction, 3 degrees in the other direction. And that would be the case here in this example. 1 degree off, because this is exactly 1 degree further away. It would actually be 4 degrees. Now, I should mention that I've deliberately kept the degree numbers very tight here, especially at the beginning. That means a very sensitive, a very receptive person could already feel something here. And in ancient astrology, that's exactly what they say. 3 to 4 degrees on each side. In modern astrology, even 6 or more. That means you simply have to check when it's that close. Whether, for example, there's nothing else happening on that day. Yes, because we'll be checking the moon soon. And I'll explain exactly that in a moment, so that's coming up very soon, exactly. But if you see, okay, there's nothing happening on that day anyway, and then you can already take that into account, even if it's perhaps 1 degree less. Yes, otherwise I just leave it out, because it's already comprehensive enough as it is. So once we're comfortable with it, once we've practiced and familiarised ourselves with the process, then, in other words, you can expand the degrees as you like. Now let's continue with the square, which, among other things, stands for challenges and confrontations. Here we have Mercury, which is in Cancer once again, and Saturn, which this time is positioned in Aries. And here, in this particular case, we get a 90-degree angle, and that's exactly what we call our square. Dividing the circle by 4 creates a right-angled cross, which is a fundamental concept in astrology. And that stands, among other important things, for a sense of tension, for various challenges, for resistance, but also, indeed, for stability and concentration of energy. In architecture, for example, a 90-degree angle is load-bearing and static. Exactly. Solid and not at all light or fluffy. 90 degrees does not correspond to a truly harmonious and balanced resonance, but rather to an incoherent or also partly destructive interference. The weave patterns do not complement each other, but instead create friction and tension. And it is precisely this tension that would normally have to be released through action. Unless we transform internally by consciously withstanding and enduring this inner tension, we cannot truly grow, because this is exactly how we use this powerful tension to ultimately refine, strengthen, and purify our energy over time. Here, energy is generated through resistance, for example by standing up for your own personal concerns and not acting against your inner truth. So that's just one example. Of course there are many more, and we will go through all of them. From phase 1 onwards, but yes, I'll just bring up the magnet example again, because it really explains this situation perfectly, where we are exposed to extraordinary, almost unbelievable tension, but we have to use this tension for ourselves, for our own benefit. It is in fact the catalyst that propels us upwards, driving us forward and helping us to grow. Without it, it wouldn't work. Yes, and I'll just show that again now. Here's an example with two magnets that I place opposite each other. The sides that repel each other, as in this case, represent situations where there is conflict or resistance. For example, in a relationship, at work, or in everyday life. And this is where tension arises. You can really feel it clearly when you hold the two magnets close together. They practically push each other away. A relatively stable resistance is created. In this case, the forces within the system remain overall balanced as a result. But now look, what happens when one magnet gives way? And that's exactly how the energy flows in a square. It's friction, it's pressure, it's a blockage. The feeling is restless, exciting, a tension, an inner tension. Challenging, but also the force for further development if you accept this force, if you face it. Right then, let's take another look at the square using the Astro-Detector. Here, we'll use the sun again and look at the 0-degree conjunction. That's always our starting line, the 0-degree conjunction, and that's what we're looking at now with the square. What's going on here? Here's our square, a 90-degree angle. Is there anything here? No planet, so nothing. And here on the other side, nothing, empty. So the sun isn't in a square with anything. Then let's continue to keep looking at the planets together, exploring what we can find. Next to it, Mercury. That one doesn't have a square on either. And then we keep looking. Here is Saturn in Cancer, here. And it forms a square to Venus in Aries. And at the same time, just about, but I would still take this into account, to Pluto, namely in Libra. Now let's take another look at this from a wider perspective, because this really is something, a highly explosive constellation. With Saturn currently here, forming a challenging square aspect to Venus, this planetary influence is significant. Note that Saturn is in Cancer here, which stands for emotions. And Saturn also stands, among other things, for rigidity, stiffness, emotional coldness. Now here it forms a square to Venus, which is in Aries, in our impulsive, combative Aries. Venus, love, relationships. And another square, borderline, but in this case I would still take note of it, with Pluto, which also stands for power, sexuality, intensity, in Libra, which in turn can also stand for love, romantic relationships. And here, with Saturn in a square aspect in Cancer, there is definitely also significant potential for transformation and change indeed. And you can see that wonderfully here. So you can systematically go through everything that's going on for yourself like this. Because things like this are ideal, you can take a closer look at them straight away. Then, and already keep it in mind for phase 1, or for now, simply take a moment to review the videos, reflect on the meanings, and see if you can recognise yourself in them once again, or if you find such constellations appearing in your own chart. And even if you might not be able to make much sense of it yet, and you still lack some clarity, that's completely understandable. After all, you're still right at the very beginning of this journey. But when we observe the moon now, it always makes its rounds here in phase 1, so we look every single day to see exactly where it is located. And that's exactly when things like this are activated. So if it has connections here, then with Saturn, with Venus, or with Pluto, the moon, then things like this can really stand out. And that happens directly in real life. You don't need anything else from that. You're just in the moment yourself and recognise it right then. And that's the huge advantage, because you simply know it then. It's knowledge based on real experience. Then we have the Trine, which stands, among other things, for harmony and ease in astrological interpretations. Here again, we have Mercury in Cancer and Saturn, which is now positioned in Pisces. And this 120-degree angle forms what is known as a trine. Geometrically speaking, a 120-degree angle corresponds to dividing a circle into 3 equal segments, which results in an equilateral triangle as formed. Each segment is stable, symmetrical, and self-balancing. You could also imagine a triangular seesaw with 3 people of equal weight sitting on it. Every movement is evenly balanced. No one tips over. Everything remains stable. The forces harmonise. However, this is precisely where the danger lies. Too much self-satisfaction, passivity, and a lack of drive. Because here, quite simply, the pressure is missing. There's no pressure to really give you a good kick up the backside so that you get moving or so that you transform, because that's what it takes to transform. To be able to rise higher, tension is necessary. You basically have to struggle to make any progress, and not everything can just happen on its own all the time. And this is exactly where a danger lies. Namely, an inner dissatisfaction despite the ease. For example, you could make more of your talent, but it just never feels urgent enough. You always end up putting it off until tomorrow somehow. Or you say, I already know that. I could do it really easily. Yes, but you just don't do it. You put it off and you just don't get going. You don't get into gear. Everything's actually going fine, but there's that certain something missing that would really let me grow, that would truly allow me to unfold my real potential. You have many strengths, you know it, but you don't use them, and that creates an underlying frustration. It's so comfortable that I don't move, but afterwards I end up feeling dissatisfied. And this is exactly where the danger lies. Yes, it leads to stagnation, to comfort, because you're not using your potential. And then you're always dissatisfied. Well, but it's not set in stone that it has to be that way. Of course, it varies depending on the situation. Yes, you can best recognise that yourself by looking at your horoscope. And now let's take a look at the trine with the Astro-Detector as well. So, now let's go trine hunting and start again with the sun. Exactly, and with our starting line right here, the conjunction at 0 degrees, which is always our starting position here in this chart, and let's see, here's the trine aspect, the 120-degree angle, which is currently empty. There is no planet located there. Here on this side as well, it is also empty, with no planet present at this position. The Sun doesn't form a trine with any other planets. Then, right, let's keep looking. To Venus. Venus forms. No, that's just a bit too far away from the Moon here, so we won't count that one now. Then let's just keep looking at Jupiter for a little while longer. Here with Jupiter, it creates a trine aspect with Mars, specifically a 4-degree trine. That means we definitely have a trine, Jupiter, Mars. Here you can see it even more clearly now, the trine, Jupiter with Mars. And besides, the big advantage here is that you can immediately, right away, see very clearly and in a very clear and visual way all the connections of Jupiter, all at a glance, so to speak. Because Jupiter also has a sextile with the Sun here at the same time. We already mentioned that. And down here as well, there's also a square with Neptune. Here, the square with Neptune. And so we have all the connections clearly and visibly in front of us, and can work with them wonderfully. Then lastly, we have our 5th aspect, our 5th connection, the opposition, which in particular also stands for conflict or balance, specifically in this context. Here we have Mercury in Cancer and Saturn, who is currently now in direct opposition to Mercury in Cancer, and who is also in his own home sign, which is Capricorn. The opposition occurs when 2 points are 180 degrees apart, geometrically speaking. The opposition corresponds to dividing the circle into 2 equal halves. The 2 distinct points both lie precisely on a perfectly straight line that divides the circle exactly in half, thereby creating what is known as a maximum axis of polarity. The energy flows here completely unhindered, without any resistance or obstruction whatsoever. So there is no tension here yet, nor any pressure. It is a straight line, and the energy can flow unhindered. However, there is a large distance here, now in contrast to the conjunction, where 2 planets are very close together, whereas here in the opposition, there is a very large distance between the 2, which means that either a kind of dynamic balance can arise if you deal with it consciously and intentionally, or a mirroring, a projection tension can develop. This is often about relationships between people, about becoming aware of yourself through the other person, but also about an inner division within oneself. Sometimes this process requires reflection and patience. And in the case of a conflict or a significant challenge, this particular situation must be endured, or rather, it must be fully recognised and understood, exactly, in order to properly balance out these different energies. Otherwise, a tearing tension arises, not a tension inherent from the start, from the nature of this connection, but rather, for instance, as an illustration, through a projection mechanism. In psychological terms, this means that what lies on the other side is not recognised as a part of oneself, but is projected onto the other. A classic example would be, "Oh right, he just insulted me. What an absolute idiot." And then you spend 3 hours getting worked up about it. But actually, it's the feeling inside us. It happens within me, and the other person has triggered it in me. And that's where you have to look at yourself, not at the other person. That's a really, really nasty business. This can go really, really deep, because you always sometimes notice it thanks to the other person. These are the triggers, exactly. You feel insulted, and there are loads of different variations of this, where you end up blaming the other person for something. But in truth, the feeling is inside us. We produce it ourselves, indeed, and it's up to us not to be left vulnerable here, no matter what the other person does, no matter how they behave. But of course, we'll go into these topics in much more detail later on. Let's move on to phase 1. The goal here, in any case, is this: becoming aware through reflection because opposition forces you to recognize yourself in the other person. And that's not painful because the channel is blocked, but because what is being reflected back isn't always pleasant. And that's exactly why, when it comes to opposition, people often talk about tension, even though in reality there's no actual tension present in this straight line. The tension is provoked by the challenge of consciousness word. Right, and now of course we'll take a closer look at the opposition using the Astro-Detector. Let's see if we can find an opposition here, and we'll start again with the Sun. No, there's nothing down here. Then we'll move on to Mercury right next to it. There's nothing there either, it's right next to it. Let's keep looking at Saturn. Nothing there either. Absolutely no opposition here at all. This is the area right here, covering 180 degrees in total with a 10-degree orb, which means 5 degrees to the left and 5 degrees to the right, just like with the conjunction. In terms of the orb, in terms of the degrees. Yes, in any case, there's no opposition there. Then we'll move on to Mars. There's no opposition to be seen there either, so no planet. And on we go down to Pluto. What you have here? Here we have a very strong and determined opposition. Let's just zoom in for a moment and take a closer look. Here we have a 2-degree opposition to Venus. And this is now extremely interesting because, as we remember, in addition to this opposition, Pluto is in Libra and Venus is in Aries. So in addition to this opposition, Saturn was also present here at this particular time, making this astrological configuration even more significant and noteworthy. In Cancer, let's turn back and align our 0-degree line with Saturn again. And there we already had a square to Venus and also one, even if borderline, to Pluto. Yes, and you could almost say this is a theme for this person. Yes, and that's already become apparent now. So you can say with great certainty that here the topic of love, the topic of sexuality, possibly emotional issues, problems expressing oneself, being rigid, whatever it may be. There are certainly more ways to express oneself here, but there do seem to be problems. Or let's say, there is definitely material for transformation here, and it is certainly a major theme for this person. Yes, and in just a few rounds, you've really already gone quite far here. And if you're lucky, you've already found something that could simply be the main issue, and often is, for people. It's noticeable that many people actually have one major theme. So there is a main theme, and of course there are smaller issues, but those aren't as difficult. They can be transformed more easily, and the main theme usually remains until the end. That's usually the last thing you deal with. But it's good to already be aware of it and to keep an eye on it throughout the course of the transformation. Of course, you start with the easier things, and exactly in the end the big chunk remains. Although, of course, it can also be that it's easier to resolve. That's not a given, is it? Cases are very individual and also different. It always depends on how much you've already done up to now, and how. Yes, how much previous damage there is. There are, of course, many more factors involved. I always just assume the worst case scenario, that it's really, really difficult. And exactly, but even the most difficult things are transformed. That is within our will. We can determine that. We simply have to recognise these things. And when we recognise them, when we see them, when we can touch them, and when we can, so to speak, press them up against the wall and say, OK, I've got you now. Yes, then you can transform it. But if you don't know what it is, and if it's just vaguely floating in the air, then it doesn't work, because you simply can't get a grip on things. But here, with this, you can get a grip on them sooner or later, especially with daily observations, of course, in combination. Right, so now we've more or less thoroughly covered the 5 main aspects in astrology. Of course, as you might expect, there are actually many possible interpretations and perspectives here, but that's not the main point we need to focus on right now. The next 7 phases are all about the intricate planetary connections. Yes, exactly. We're talking about both the aspects themselves and the planets involved in these relationships, and how everything is positioned and how it all influences each other. But in general, yes, you could say that. The most important thing is to have understood the essence, to have internalised it. Then also, but first of all, to have truly and deeply understood it. That's why we have the geometric explanation, so mathematics. But on the other hand, also to really feel it, to have a genuine sense for it. And that's why there's also the emotional or feeling-based explanation. Yes, and once you've really felt your way into it, and once you've also thought your way into it, then you definitely already have a better understanding than if you had left out one of the 2, yes? If you had skipped one of the 2, yes. And the rest, as I said, is now about observing, daily tracking. That's about to start. Very soon, in the next episode, it's going to be about the houses again. I actually considered whether to release that episode at all. Because, well, in ancient astrology, the houses were calculated differently than in modern astrology. That means, yes, we don't use them in the way that some of you may already know or be familiar with, because there are quite a few of you who are already professional astrologers here, and of course you know about or use the modern house system in your own practice. But we don't use it like that here, or rather, in these particular videos, we will be specifically using the ancient house method, which is a different approach. And that's why I was considering whether to bring up this topic now, because, to be honest, at the beginning we don't actually need the houses yet, since at the moment we're tracking every day how the moon is influencing us, and we can see anyway which area of life is affected. So the moment itself already tells us that. But yes, exactly. But since there are already quite a few experienced people here with us, so I thought I'll bring this up again in the next episode. Exactly, simply to provide some clarity, and especially because the experienced ones here can also have a look. Yes, as I said, ancient astrology is really straightforward, much simpler. I'll explain that in the next episode, so please stay tuned. It's actually really simple and straightforward, so there's absolutely nothing complicated at all about applying this new or old system to your situation. Exactly, and that's especially true for those who already have some prior experience. We can take a look and see exactly what they make of it for themselves. And all 9, yes, it really does not matter, because we will definitely get to the houses in the future, but not at the beginning, since we simply do not need them yet. And because it's much easier without them to start with. It's just too confusing and too much for us. First, we need to make sure we're following our feelings, and to recognise this here, so that we can, so to speak, transform ourselves. Yes, and so the next video will be about the houses. I'm looking forward to having you tune in again. Take care until then. Bye-bye.